Hello, and welcome to this podcast on microplastics. In this interview, Dr. Suja Sukumaran from Thermo Fisher Scientific and Dr. Monica Arienzo from the Desert Research Institute in Nevada will be discussing how imaging, microscopy, and chemical analysis tools are being used to help assess the impact that microplastics are having on our environment, as well as broader issues around how these materials get into the environment in the first place and where the future may take this research. Suja Sukumaran is a senior applications scientist at Thermo Fisher Scientific with expertise in molecular spectroscopy, imaging, and biochemistry. Monica Arienzo is an assistant research professor in hydrology at the DRI. Dr. Arienzo's work over her career has all centered around the ways in which humans impact our environment, but her current research focuses on microplastics wherever they are found, from lakes and rivers to even snowy mountaintops and in our drinking water.
Thank you, Monica, for joining us today. This is excellent to have you here. I have some very simple questions for you so that we can get started here on this discussion about microplastics. But first and foremost, I think I want to ask you is, how did you get started with microplastics and what motivated you to go into this field?
Yeah, thank you, Suja, and it's wonderful to have this chance to talk to you about microplastics and the research me and the community are doing on this emerging contaminant. So my research in microplastics really started when I was attending a conference in Switzerland. And prior to working on microplastics, I was studying human impacts to the environment. So I was attending this conference and listening to these talks, and this researcher was discussing how they were finding these tiny pieces of plastic in Arctic sea ice. And I was blown away by this. I was really just captivated by this talk, and I came back to Reno, Nevada, where I live, and I continued to think about this talk and about these tiny plastic particles they were finding in the Arctic. And it made me think, if they're finding these plastic particles in the Arctic, are they maybe here in my backyard? And I started thinking about, the snow that feeds our water resources here in the Western United States. I started thinking about our water resources. And all of these questions I kept sort of ruminating on and reading about microplastics. And I got really lucky. There was an opportunity to apply for funding to do innovative research. And my colleagues and I applied, and we actually got funded, and we began to be able to study microplastics locally in our environment here near where I live. And that's how we started.
That is great, Monica. That's really good to know what inspired you. And so you mentioned about working on microplastics in the Reno, Nevada area. So what type of or where all you have found microplastics, or your lab have found microplastics so far, that you can tell our audience about?
So far, researchers have found microplastics all over the globe, from rainfall to the deep ocean, to sea ice in the Arctic, to sediments deposited in lakes and in the ocean. And there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to understand the sources of microplastics and then their ultimate fate in the environment. In my group, we primarily focus on microplastics in freshwater environments. Everywhere my group has looked, we have found microplastics. We found them in snow in the mountain ranges out here in the western US. We found them in remote lakes and streams. We've also been looking in more urbanized environments, and we've actually found microplastics in Lake Mead, which is an important water resource for Las Vegas. And other researchers have also confirmed this, that they too have found plastics in the waters that feed into Lake Mead. We also recently have been looking at the fish that live in the waters near Lake Mead, and in fact, we've also found plastics in their stomachs. We hope that we can continue to do this type of research to understand where plastics are located in the environment, with the hopes that we can help to inform solutions to these microplastics in the environment.
Thank you so much for that, Monica. It's so important to first definitely understand where these things are found. But now I think that my follow-up question is also like, okay, we deal with plastics on a day-to-day basis, and yes, these small bits are found in fishes and in lakes and oceans. So in your opinion, why is it so concerning to have these microplastics in the environment?
That's a good question. And the science of microplastics is really an emerging field of research where I think we still have more questions than we have answers of, what are the impacts of these plastic particles in the environment? And what are the impacts to the environment as well as to, human health? I think there's still a lot of work to be done there. But there's a lot of really great researchers working on this problem. And, my work, what we found in my work is that there are plastics in important water resources. And those water resources are important for agriculture use or for drinking water. And the state of California has really led the way in studying microplastics in drinking water. I know that they recently published a methodology for how we can begin to study microplastics in drinking water. And so I know in the future we're going to have more information about the impacts of microplastics on the environment and also then where those plastics may be ending up. So I look forward to seeing a lot of that work because I think it'll be really informative as we move forward.
That is correct. Yes, that's a great point. Yes, that California definitely is leading the way with all the method development as well as a lot of information that has been coming out on all these studies in the bay as well as in the oceans all across, as well as in the freshwater resources. So one of the question that comes up now that there are so many labs that are interested in studying microplastics, which is in freshwater or in oceans or in other sources. So because these particles that the researchers are looking at are so small, can you actually outline how you went about working with them? So basically, like, how does the collection to the analysis look like to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are a lot of different approaches for how we sample for microplastics in the environment. And each sampling approach really has its pros and its cons. And when we think about how we're going to sample and process our samples in the laboratory, we try to think about what is the research question we're trying to answer and what is the best method then to apply. And so in my group, a lot of our work is focused on sampling in remote, hard to reach places. And so we need a sampling approach that really allows us to go to those remote locations to do our sampling and bring the samples back to the laboratory for processing them in a clean environment. So what we've been doing recently is we've been working on a method that uses a portable pump. So we can carry this pump in a backpack. We can go to our sampling location. We can then pump water from the sampling site through a series of filters. And these filters they have holes in them of a known size. And so basically the water flows through those filters, but anything bigger than those holes in the filter will get trapped onto the surface of the filter. We then bring those filters back to the laboratory and then we will remove anything that's not a plastic. So we can basically isolate the plastic material and then we analyze for that. So other things that we may find on our filters that aren't plastics are things like sediments, algae, sometimes some bugs get into our samples. And we then do a series of steps to remove all that other material that's not a plastic. And we then isolate those plastics and we look at them under our Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy instrument. And this allows us to look at really small particles down to about 20 microns in size. And we can use this instrument to identify the type of plastic in our sample. And then we combine that information with information about the size of the particle, the shape, the color, and all of that information helps us to understand potential sources of that piece of plastic. So, for example, if we identify a piece of nylon fiber, let's say, in our sample, we would then begin to suspect textiles materials as being a potential source of that piece of plastic. And so we bring all of this information together to help understand, what are the types of plastics we are finding in the environment and where are they potentially sourced from.
Thank you, Monica. Yes, that's so good to hear the whole start to the end process. And you talked about your team, and I have heard some of your talks before as well. You work a lot with the citizen scientists and volunteers. So, how does this process work? Basically, can you just describe it for our audience?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite parts of my jobs is working with the community. We, from the very beginning, from the first grant we wrote, we really wanted to engage the community in the science we were doing. This is called citizen science, which means community members taking an active part in the scientific process. And we really wanted to do this because I think something like microplastics, which maybe can be hard to visualize a small piece of plastic in the environment. But plastics itself, as you mentioned, is something that we interact with all the time. And so we really felt that this was a great opportunity to bring the community members into our research and to help them understand this issue of plastics and plastic pollution and the amount of plastic we work with. Additionally, we hope that by engaging the community in our research, we can help inform solutions that are relevant to the community that we're working with. So it serves as sort of this two-way street where we get to learn from the community about what's important to them, and then we also get to engage them in helping us do scientific research. For us, we've approached citizen scientists by working with local organizations that already are doing citizen science. So we work with the League to Save Lake Tahoe, which already does a lot of citizen science work studying pollutants in Lake Tahoe. And so we've been able to work with these nonprofits to tap into the local communities and engage individuals in our research. We also do a lot of other work with local organizations, including we've been recently working with Clean Up the Lake, which is another nonprofit working to remove trash out of Lake Tahoe. And so we work with them to help understand what are the sources of plastic pollution so we can help inform future studies on how we can mitigate those sources.
That's such an important piece of information here, Monica, I feel like, because that bringing the community together to answer such a key question in science, because it's a cause that I feel like almost everybody should be concerned about, because we use so much plastics on our day-to-day life. And then if we can be part of basically like the whole initiative to understand these as well as to help with the cleanup of these, I mean, that's absolutely amazing. Well, continuing on with that same thought, my next question would be for you is more in terms of like, with all this research that you and all these amazing citizen scientists are able to do, what type of impact do you see these results having for the environmental education as well as for the whole thought process for the next generation by itself?
Yeah, it's another great question and another part of my job that I really enjoy. I am really lucky. I get to mentor students from high school age through graduate students. And the reason why I love this part of my job so much is I work with the students to provide them and to work with them to do hands-on research. And so these students come into my group, they design their experiments, they then carry out those experiments, and then they summarize their findings for the scientific community. And I love watching my students go through that process of learning the scientific process And seeing that end result of them presenting, whether it be at a conference or even locally within the community, is just a wonderful part of my job. I also get a lot of inspiration from the students I mentor. The next generation of scientists are so creative and smart and dedicated to understanding these environmental issues and trying to find solutions to help, address these relatively complex issues that their generation is going to have to help solve. And I love working with them so much. It's really a great part of my job. And in addition to the work I'm doing sort of more in, say, the higher ed space, we are in the beginning phases of developing a middle school lesson plan. So here where I work at the Desert Research Institute, we have a program called the Science Alive program, where we create lesson plans for local Nevada schools. And what we do is we develop these lesson plans, we then test them, and then we disseminate them to the community. And we provide all of the materials that the teachers would need to carry out those lesson plans. So it's really a really positive and wonderful program because it really allows teachers to use lessons in their classroom that have been tested, but also then provides them with all the materials they need. And so we are really excited because we're going to be working with this program to develop a series of middle school lesson plans focused on plastic pollution and hydrology. And so hopefully this will help to bring our research and our findings into the K through 12 space, which I also think is really important for, again, getting kids really interested in science at an early age.
Yes, that is such a critical message actually you have conveyed here. I mean, I think the two things you mentioned about having the next generation learn about it right from their middle school and all the way from K to 12, it's so important. But the other part is also that generation is also very keen on this issue by itself. And I mean, including I hear this in my home as well. My little girl is so concerned when we do not recycle or we do recycle properly. It's like it has to go into the right bin. And I think it's so important to see this initiative, and thanks to researchers like you as well as DRI for doing this amazing work. So, one of the other things, I mean, I know a lot about your research and the work that you have been doing in last couple of years. Where do you see your research going in next 5 or 10 years from now?
Yeah, it's a great question. My work is really focused on microplastics in the environment. So we are really interested in understanding the sources of plastics to the environment and then how they're being transported within the environment and their ultimate fate. So where are they ending up in the environment? And we're sort of thinking about that right now, sort of from the sources. Right now, we're really focusing a lot of our work on looking at dryers as a source of microplastics to the environment. So every time you dry your clothes, the hot air that's generated inside of your clothes dryer is actually vented outside of your home. And we did a series of studies, again, working with citizen scientists, as well as some laboratory-based studies, where we try to look at what is coming out of the end of those dryers and what is being vented into the environment. And in fact, so far, our preliminary data suggests that there's quite a bit of material that's actually making it out of that dryer vent and into the environment. And a subset of that material is in fact synthetic. And so this may be an important source of plastics, particularly in the US, where this is the standard type of dryer that we have here that sort of vents this hot air outside. And then when you think about how many people, how often you dry your clothes, right? And, you multiply that, it becomes a fairly big number. And so this is sort of one area of research we're working on to get at one potential source of plastics to the environment. The other way we're looking at the source of plastics to the environment is actually by looking at plastic pollution, so looking at large pieces of plastic in the environment. And this work we're doing is trying to understand how those big pieces of plastic may be breaking down to form these microplastics. And so to do this work, we've been doing both laboratory and field-based studies. And so in the laboratory, we'll expose plastics to different environmental conditions. And then we'll look to see if we can see those changes we see in the laboratory, if we can see those in environmental plastics. So I have become the trash collector. I have bags and bags of trash now in my lab that I sift through and try to look at this trash to understand, how might these big pieces of plastic be breaking down to form smaller and smaller pieces of plastic. And so both of these studies are really focused on trying to understand the sources of microplastics to the environment. And really at the end of the day, what I hope is that we can use the science we learn in these examples to help inform solutions to, where are the plastics coming from and reducing those inputs into the environment.
Again, that is such an important point you brought up, Monica, that, you can have these really large pieces of plastics which just ultimately break down into smaller pieces, and then it just ends up in water and in our food chain and even in air, right? So through the dryers and other places, basically, it's we basically are polluting the entire globe with plastics in very short time, actually. For all this work that you have been doing, do you face certain challenges with certain techniques or methods when you're trying to analyze these or come to a conclusion on some of your studies?
One of the main challenges right now that we're facing is, I think, there's so many questions that we have about plastics. I think one of the challenges is actually, being able to, that it just feels like there's so much to do. And I think one thing that would really help, particularly the work, my group does on sort of freshwater microplastics, would be to develop a rapid screening approach. So we spend a lot of our time collecting these samples, analyzing them in the laboratory, and if we could find a faster way to rapidly screen a location or screen a sample to say, are there microplastics, yes or no, I think that would really be helpful, because then we can really then target areas of interest. So if we're really interested in maybe highly contaminated areas, we could rapidly screen, see if they are contaminated, and then we could then do a deep dive into that one location or one sample type to really get at, what are the plastics present and how many and what type are they. And so I think that's sort of one area that I think would really help push sort of the environmental microplastics forward, is sort of a rapid screening approach.
Yes, that again, Monica, is a very important aspect of this whole microplastic study. Is, I think, seeing these microplastics really quick and where they are, what type they are, and what can be done with those is so important. Whether it's freshwater, ocean, or wastewater, all the different sources, knowing this particular thing is so important to get to the next level of cleanup and so forth. Coming to the conclusion of this discussion, I think I have to ask, where do you see the whole plastic pollution research going in next couple of years? And is the whole idea of cleaning up the planet actually achievable? For all the damages that we have already done, is it really even possible to get there?
So when I think about cleaning up pollutants, I often remind myself about the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act here in the US. And in particular, I'm always drawn to thinking about lead pollution. So When cars were first, becoming popular, leaded gasoline was commonly used. And in part, it had to do with, how the engines were designed at the time. And adding lead helped those engines run more smoothly. But then we realized that lead in that gasoline was actually, making its way into our environment, and then actually being, becoming found. It was actually then found in blood samples of children and adults. And so that led to legislation that restricted the use of leaded gasoline. And now we've seen, when we look at the lead records, whether they be in, atmospheric samples or in ice core samples, we can really see this decrease in the environment of the concentrations of lead. And so I always remind myself of the ability when we come together, whether it be, at a national scale or even at a global scale, to tackle pollutants, that we really can make a difference. And so when I think about the future of, plastic pollution in the environment, I always try to remind myself that there's a lot of opportunities out there to find these solutions. And then when we come together, we can actually make a difference, and we actually can reduce pollutants in the environment. So that's what I always try to remind myself, because sometimes it does feel a little, out of reach, and like it's going to be difficult, and it will be difficult. But I always try to remind myself that, we've identified pollutants in the past in the environment, and we've been able to find solutions. And I believe that the solutions, particularly for plastic, will be complex. But I think when we bring together diverse scientists, so whether it's diversity in thought or diversity in background, we can come together, and this is how we'll develop these solutions to these complex problems, is by bringing different perspectives together and thinking about these issues.
I think that was awesome, Monica, and we really are honored to have you here, and I'm pretty sure our listeners have gotten a lot of good insights from your work at DRI, and we look forward to more of your work in near future. Thank you.